Welcome back, everybody, to the Philadelphia Eagles franchise here on Madden 22. Today, we're going to be previewing the 2025 NFL Draft, in which we're going to be going through the draft class again, looking at some film and evaluating these players. Going to be doing some mock drafts as well. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. So last episode, we started the offseason and really did everything that leads up to the draft. It was a very jam-packed episode. In case you missed it, make sure to check it out in the series playlist. I'll also leave a card at the top right of your screen as well. So we saw the head coaching changes. There are 3 new head coaches in the league. Patrick Willis with the Falcons, Brian Daboll with Seattle, and Pep Hamilton with the Giants. A lot of big names retiring, including Nick Foles, Lane Johnson, Julio Jones, Von Miller, Terron Armstead, Dante Hightower, Darius Slay, Zach Ertz, Fletcher Cox. As for the re-sign phase, we brought back a number of key players, including Devontae Smith to an $80 million extension, as well as Cleveland Ferrell and Jason Kelce. In free agency, we spent big. We acquired veterans Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt, probably the 2 best defensive players of our generation, are now on our football team. Even though they're both a little bit older, it should be a lot of fun to have them both. We also went out and made a trade for offensive guard Cesar Ruiz from the New Orleans Saints. We attempted to sign Trey Smith in free agency. It didn't really work out, so we were able to get Ruiz for a fair price, and he's now on our offensive line. There were plenty of other big moves around the league. Russell Ingram to the Rams, King Carver and TK Walker being swapped for each other. Joey Bosa is now in our division. He's going to be a New York Giant. And then Dalvin Cook going to the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons also added Jalen Waddle and Kadarius Toney to their offense, so they're serious about actually being good this year. So as we go into the draft preview, there aren't really many glaring holes on this football team, and I think we're in a good spot to where we can really focus on drafting the best player available. We're really going to be focusing on guys who can contribute right away as rookies, because I think we are so close to being a Super Bowl level team. We made the NFC Championship last year. I think we got better in free agency with the additions of Aaron Donald, J.J. Watt, and Cesar Ruiz. So I think we can really add the final piece to the puzzle here today with the draft. As it stands now, we own the 30th pick in the first round, along with 62, 94, and a mixture of picks in day 3. We do not own a 5th, but we own Buffalo's 6th and Seattle's 7th. So let's start talking about this draft class. It's a really fun group of players. During the free agency, I had to choose 3 players for us to put private workouts into. The 3 players I ended up picking were Fred Campbell, offensive guard, linebacker Wilton Emerton, and tight end Machado Yamaguchi. I chose these 3 players strategically. I'll explain a little bit more as to why I picked them when we go over each of them as we go through the draft class right here. So we're going to go position by position, starting at quarterback. I also want to point out really quickly that there was no scouting combine this year. The NFL could not agree to a location with the new collective bargaining agreement, so everybody only had a pro day, but not a combine. I figured I would point that out real quick. So as it stands now, the top quarterback of the class is Drake Nelson out of Alabama, and personally, I would be very, very surprised if he's not the top quarterback off the board. I don't think he's going to go number 1 overall, and I think compared to most draft classes, he probably wouldn't be QB1, but because it is a weaker QB class, I think he will be the top quarterback off the board. But that's not to diminish him as a prospect in any means. He has some really good arm talent. He's really athletic. He just needs to improve upon his consistency, and if he does, I think he'll be really good. I don't think the Falcons are going to pick him at number 1 overall because they just drafted a quarterback in the first round last year. So I think the teams to look at would be the Raiders at 2, Seattle at 3, the Jets at 4, and the Saints at 5. I'd be very surprised if he fell out of the top 5. So barring a trade, I think it's going to be one of those 4 teams that he ends up with. After Drake Nelson, the only surefire first-round quarterback along with him is Crawford Shawcross out of Wisconsin. This is the same school that our starting quarterback Xander Vanderwall went to, and I honestly see a lot of similarities in their games. I think Crawford Shawcross is pretty much the right-handed version of Xander Vanderwall in the sense that neither of them have super exciting strengths, but neither of them have glaring weaknesses. Both of them are decently athletic, they can move around in the pocket, they have decently strong arms, and they're pretty accurate. Shawcross performed quite well at his pro day, cementing himself as a likely top 10 pick. I think he'll be the second quarterback off the board, just like Xander Vanderwall was in his draft 3 years ago. After those 2, we've got Norman Collier out of Oklahoma, who probably was the best quarterback this season out of any QB in the class. And because of that, his stock rose up dramatically to a possible top 15 pick. But because his stock is all over the place, I also see a world where he doesn't go in the first round. So I'm really not sure where Norman Collier is going to end up. He's a pretty unique player because Madden lists his archetype as a scrambler, but I see him a little bit more as a field general. He doesn't have the strongest arm. He is pretty athletic and he can move, but I think the name of this game is his smarts, his decision making, and his accuracy. He doesn't have a good deep ball, but really anything within 20 to 25 yards, he's going to hit that throw 80% of the time, which is why I think teams are really going to like him. After that, we get to the likely day 2 quarterbacks. Maybe Keontae Shalaby II from USC falls into the first round. I'd be a little bit surprised, but there are some teams who are going to really like him. Shalaby does not have elite arm talent at all, which I think is the big concern with him, but he is a human highlight reel. He is an absolute freak of nature. Think Nico Cabanera, the quarterback out of Coastal Carolina from last year's class, who ended up going number 1 overall to the Los Angeles Rams. Although that was a bad pick, clearly teams were higher on Nico Cabanera than I was, and maybe that'll be the case here with Keontae Shalaby II out of USC. I'm very curious to see where he ends up. I would guess probably early second round. I think the best value of any of the quarterbacks in this class is Tyler Elliott from Texas Tech. He might have the best pure arm talent of anybody in the draft class. I don't think there's anybody with his arm strength along with his mix of accuracy. He's not the most consistent. He's also not the most athletic. He is a little bit, well, dare I say, not good under pressure, but he can absolutely sling the rock, and I think teams are really going to appreciate the arm talent he brings to the table, even if he's not as good of a runner, even if he can't navigate the pocket as well as somebody like Drake Nelson or even Norman Collier. So I'm really not sure where Elliott ends up. I think if this was 20 years ago, he'd be the top quarterback off the board, but the league has changed a little bit, so I'm really not sure what his stock looks like. After that, we get to the next tier of quarterbacks, guys like Jacob King, Lance Brooks, Jeremy Lynch. There are some really talented guys here down the board who could end up being steals in the third round and beyond. We didn't really talk about running backs that in depth in the running back prospect profile because, well, we're not drafting a running back early. There are some very good ones in this class. Ravon Stewart from Texas A&M could be a first-round pick. Smash Williams, another Texas guy. He's from Texas itself. James Wetzelberger out of Rutgers, 5'10", 205. And then we've got Malik Bostic II coming from Westlake. Westlake has churned out talented running backs. Look at Matt Miller with the Jets, Tazwell Hubbard with the Eagles, Adam Rutledge with the Dolphins, and now Malik Bostic II is next on the list. It's not a very deep running back class, which isn't necessarily bad for us because, well, we don't need a running back. But there is one name down the board to look out for, Diallo Cooper, 6'4", 250 pounds. He is a physical specimen. This is a very deep receiver class, but it isn't necessarily top-heavy, excluding Orlando Higgins Jr. out of Indiana, who is a surefire top 5 pick. And unless we have an early quarterback off the board, he will likely be the top offensive player chosen. Orlando Higgins Jr., in my opinion, is probably the best receiving prospect so far in this entire franchise series, and I think him going to the Las Vegas Raiders at 2 makes so much sense. The Raiders have probably the worst receiving core in the NFL right now. They don't have a clear number 1 receiver. I'm pretty sure their highest rated guy currently is a 79 overall, so they could really use a guy like Orlando Higgins, who's fast, but he's even quicker than fast. Great agility, super exciting with the ball in his hands, and he doesn't drop many passes. He's a surefire receiver who is reliable and exciting. After him, you've got a ton of other possible first-rounders. We didn't really go into any of them super deep in the prospect profiles we've done because we're not going to pick a receiver in the first round, but there are a lot of good ones. There are literally 11 guys who could go in the first round. I don't think all 11 will. I would expect probably 6 or 7 to go in round 1, but we really have no idea which 6 or 7 it's going to be. Tight end is kind of the big need on the Eagles, arguably the biggest need on the roster, so there's a really good shot we do end up picking one probably on day 2. Omondo Odede out of Westlake is the top tight end in this draft class. He was the number 1 prospect in his high school class, and although he never had the elite production in college that you hope for, he is still the top projected tight end in this class based on upside. Odede, in my opinion, is the most well-rounded tight end in this class. He's a talented receiver with really good athleticism, but he's also a pretty strong blocker, and he's really improved as a blocker throughout his college career, which is why I think he'll be the top tight end off the board. But there are probably 4 guys who all could contend for that top tight end spot, including Tryman Bird out of Georgia. Bird is the most physically exciting tight end in this draft class, coming in at 6'7" with a near 7-foot wingspan. Of the top 4 tight ends, he's also by far the youngest, just turning 21, making him a full 2 years older than the top tight end, Omondo Odede, and younger by at least a year than the guys below him. Bird is probably the most raw of the group, which is why he's not a surefire, slam dunk, top tight end off the board, but with his upside, I have a hard time feeling he's going to get out of the second round, and the Eagles very well could look at him with pick 62. Another option in that range is Machado Yamaguchi out of USC. We picked Yamaguchi as one of our 3 focus players because he has not played all year with an injury that he suffered during spring ball. So Yamaguchi's coming off the injury, but the Eagles have shown that they're willing to draft players coming off of injury. Edmund Orion only played 3 games his junior season, and the Eagles picked him in the first round last year, and he had a good rookie year, so maybe the same could work with Yamaguchi. There's also Chuck Fiore out of Florida State, who's more of an inline blocking tight end. He's not your new school type of tight end like a Mike Gesicki or a Dawson Knox or a Kyle Pitts, or even guys like Yamaguchi and Bird in this year's class. Fiore is a very old-school tight end. On some snaps, you can use him as a number 6 offensive lineman, and he's as good of a blocker as those guys. As a tight end, he's a good route runner. He has good hands. He's not going to give you anything after the catch, and he's really not all that athletic or explosive, but he's just very reliable, and he can give you very steady play for the next decade. So I think you really can't go wrong with any of those top 4 because they all bring a different skill set. They all have a lot of positives to their game. It's a really talented offensive line class, and as we look at left tackle, the top one on the board is Hennigan Patrice out of Nebraska, who really feels like the only surefire first-round left tackle, but there are probably 5 left tackles who could go in round 1, but there's also 1 left tackle who could go in round 1. This is definitely one of the most interesting position groups in the draft. Patrice in particular is very interesting because he was only a 1-year starter at Nebraska, but last year he was damn good. He doesn't have the same experience that some of the guys below him do, but he was probably the best offensive lineman in college football last year. Behind him, we've got Abraham Belkett Jr., Iemi Duyo, Kennesaw Burke, and Nye Uther. As I said earlier, I see a world where 1 left tackle goes in the first round, but I could also see 4 or 5. That's going to be a really fascinating position group come draft day. At left guard, we've got Fred Campbell out of Westlake, who was another one of our 3 focus players who we had private workouts for. I chose Campbell because I think he would make a lot of sense with the 30th pick, and I think there's probably over a 50% chance that he will be on the board when we do pick at 30. I think there's a good chance he doesn't get picked in the first round, but at pick 30, I don't think it's a reach at all. I think he could certainly battle for that starting left guard position with Fletcher Luce and Marcus Crum, both of whom I think are also capable starters. I think Campbell's probably better than those guys, though, right away. So if the Eagles want an immediate upgrade and set their offensive line perfectly, he could be the pick. At center, it's very weak here at center. Good thing we drafted Fletcher Luce in the second round a couple years ago. At right guard, there's Lewis Palmer, again out of Westlake. I think Fred Campbell's probably a little bit better day 1 than Lewis Palmer, but I think Palmer is a little bit more upside, which is why he's probably going to go higher, possibly as early as the top 10-ish. Probably 10 or 11 is the earliest I could see him end up going. As I said, I think he's a little bit more raw, but I think the upside is definitely there, and he could be one of the best guards in football, which is why I expect him to get picked in the top half of the first round. We haven't scouted as much of him as Fred Campbell because, as I said, I don't think Palmer is going to be on the board. If he is, that would be a major surprise. Deshaun McKinley from Texas State will also be a likely first-rounder. At right tackle, Blake Wilson's been a big draft riser. He had a phenomenal combine report and could very well sneak into the top 10, whereas when we did the original prospect profile on him, I wasn't sure if he was going to be a top 20 pick. Zachariah Wester-Schlott from Stanford is also a likely surefire first-rounder. At defensive end, Ladarian Mobley and Adafa Klafawar are both really good, and both I expect will be in the top half of the first round. Klafawar is a really fun story because he's super raw, he's pretty new to the game of football, and this was his first year as a starting defensive end for Temple, but he was really, really good. Hometown kid, went to high school in Philly, went to college in Philly. Wouldn't it be fun for him to play in the pros in Philly? But with his athletic pedigree and upside, he will not be on the board at pick 30, so he would be more likely a trade-up candidate. The Eagles traded up for Jabari Achabe a few years ago. Maybe they'd be willing to do it again. It's not like Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt are going to be here probably after next year. Zahir Yaha out of Ohio State is probably the best pass rusher in this draft class and will likely be a top 5 pick. His brother, Musafa Yahya, was the 3rd overall pick last year to the Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders pick at 2 this year, so although it would be really fun to see those two paired together, that's not going to happen because the one thing the Raiders don't need is pass rush. They've drafted a pass rusher in the first round every single draft in this series so far. So they have no reason to do that again, especially if Orlando Higgins Jr., the wide receiver from Indiana, is on the board. So assuming Yaha is on the board after 2, I could see him in Seattle, with the Jets, with New Orleans. Probably won't fall much farther after that. Defensive tackle's been a pretty big need for us for a while, and with Fletcher Cox retiring, that's even more clear. We did sign Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt, but you got to remember, Donald is 34. Watt is 36. They are not long-term options, so we probably will look at a defensive tackle early. Zaire Savage from Cincinnati is the top defensive tackle on the board, and I think he will be available at pick 30. I thought about choosing him as one of our 3 focus players, but we already had him 80% scouted, so I figured that would be kind of pointless. He had a phenomenal combine report, so I'm a little bit worried he will be picked before the 30th overall selection, but I think chances are he will be available, and if he is, he's going to be atop the list of guys who we would consider there at that spot. If we don't land Zaire Savage, a backup option I really like is Ledger Olundanye from UAB with our 2nd round pick. I think Olundanye at pick 62 is probably better value than Zaire Savage at 30. I'm not convinced Olundanye is going to be on the board at 62, but if he is, I think that could be a really good pick. Olundaye has had really dominant stretches with the UAB Blazers throughout his career, and I think he could really slide in and make an immediate impact for us if we were to select him. For him or Zaire Savage, I think this would be an ideal landing spot for both of them. Imagine being mentored by Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt, the 2 best interior defensive linemen probably of the last 30 years, at least. Maybe even farther than that. So if you're a defensive tackle, I would hope to go to the Eagles because learning from those 2 sounds great. The 3rd and final focus player we drafted for our pre-draft workout was linebacker Wilton Emeton from Alabama. Although Emeton is listed as a linebacker, he definitely has the size and length to play 4'3" defensive end, coming in at 6'3", 260 pounds. I think there's a 0% chance Wilton Emeton will be on the board with our 30th overall pick, but the reason why I chose him as a focus player is because he's really not getting top 10 buzz, and I think he's a top 10 player in this draft class. So if he slips out of the top 10 or 15 picks, we may consider a trade-up for him, which is why I really wanted to add him. I think it's very, very unlikely Wilton Emeton will be an Eagle, but I wanted to leave the door open. At middle linebacker, there's a lot of possible first-rounders: Chauncey Burks, Kenneth Barker, Desmond Clay, Sterling Babineau. I don't think we're going to look at middle linebacker early because we have Isaiah Simmons locked up for a while, and he was really, really good last year, and we have plenty of other young linebackers behind him. Right outside linebacker is pretty weak. You do have a few former Westlake Hornets here scattered throughout the linebacking position. There are like 4 or 5 Westlake linebackers who probably will end up getting drafted. At corner, we've got the #1 player in this year's draft class, Bryson Barraclaw out of Kentucky, who is the surefire #1 overall pick. 6'2", 20 years old, great size, great length, very good in coverage. He's phenomenal in man and zone. He has great ball skills. He's a good tackler, high character kid. He checks everything off the box, which is why he's probably going to be the #1 pick. The Atlanta Falcons are choosing #1 overall, and I think if they keep that pick, Bryson Barraclaw will be the selection. However, I think there are going to be a lot of teams who try to move up, and Atlanta's biggest strength on their roster currently is cornerback. So, although I think Barraclaw is a shoo-in to go #1 overall, I don't think he's a shoo-in to go to Atlanta, per se. I see a world where that pick gets traded, but if not, and Atlanta does stay at #1 overall, no need to get cute. Just go chalk, get the best player in the draft class. Behind him, it's a really good cornerback class, and I think a lot of these guys behind him would be the top corner in their class if not for him. That includes Darsheen Brooks Jr. out of Westlake, who I expect to be a top 10 selection. And again, most years he would have a real argument to be CB1, if not for Bryson Barraclaw being as good as he is. Darsheen Brooks Jr. has been a very good starter for Westlake the past couple of seasons. He probably should have declared for the draft last year as a junior because he was arguably a little bit worse this year as a senior, but he was still really good, so I'm sure he'll be a top 10 pick, and I'm sure he will be worth that selection. Behind him, there's Knox Hodgson out of Florida State, who's going to be probably the 3rd corner off the board, and again, a very possible top 10 pick. Knox Hodgson had some games where he completely took over. Against Clemson, he dominated, single-handedly winning that game for the Florida State Seminoles. And although Hodgson has had some really good moments, he's also a little bit inconsistent, which is why he's not the top corner in this class, even if his high moments are arguably higher than Bryson Barraclough's. If you can teach Hodgson some really good technique and just get him to be more consistent, look out. He could be a stud, but he's got a lot of work to do. Behind him, there's Ribar Coley Jr., who's been out all year, but probably will be a first-round pick. And then after that, we've got one of the biggest draft risers of the past season, Josh Demerit from Clemson. Demerit, I think, would be a really good fit on our defense because with Deshaun Elliott going, that means last year's nickel corner, Edmund Orient, will slide over to his natural position of 3 safety, leaving nickel corner wide open. Josh Demerit is a prototypical nickel corner, and I think he would slide right in there and be a perfect fit with Nehemiah Richardson and C.J. Thomas on the outside. I don't think Demerit has the size or length to be a good outside corner, but he has been elite in the nickel, and if he's on the board at 30, which is looking less and less likely by the day, he would be a really good fit for our defense. Although it's a top-heavy cornerback draft class, I don't think it's too deep. Outside of those top 5 guys, the only one who I really like is Marion Smith-Gardner from Westlake, another huge draft riser over the past season. Smith-Gardner is built pretty similarly to Josh Demerit in the sense that he's a little bit smaller. He doesn't have elite length, but he's a lot more athletic than Josh Demerit, which is why he's more of an outside corner. Smith-Gardner has only been really good for 1 year, though, which is why he's a little bit lower for Demerit. And although I think Smith-Gardner is the better prospect, I think Demerit is a better fit for our defense. So if both of them are on the board at 30 and we do end up going corner, that's going to be a tough decision because there are some real pros and cons to both Josh Demerit and Marion Smith-Gardner because I think they're both really good. As I said, it's not an overly deep cornerback class, so if we want to go with one early, we might have to do it in the first round. We've used numerous high draft picks on DBs in this series. First rounders on Nehemiah Richardson and Edmund Orient. C.J. Thomas was the top pick in the second round. So we're willing to use high picks on DBs. As we look at safety, there's Frank Washington out of Westlake. I don't expect us to go safety early this season. I think Edmund Orient is more of a free safety than a nickel corner, so I would rather him play his natural position this upcoming season. So unless we were to move a guy like Frank Washington to the nickel, which I don't really think would make a whole lot of sense, I don't think we're really going to look at Frank Washington, but I do really like him as a prospect. I think he's really well-rounded. He's going to be a very good pro right off the bat, and is one of the most NFL-ready players in this draft class. So I think he'll be a very worthy top, probably 15 to 20 pick. Really deep safety class. There are a number of guys down the board I really like. Zyquel White, Chris Gentry, LaQuavian Johnson. It's a very deep group, and the same can be said at strong safety, featuring Westlake's Fred Blunt, who stands at 6'5". He's a really interesting physical specimen, and although we have Joko Onwosu already at strong safety, who was a Pro Bowler last year, I wouldn't be opposed to adding a guy like Fred Blunt and have him in sub packages as like a sub linebacker. Our sub linebackers are in a majority of the game. We play most of our defensive snaps in sub packages, so I think he would be a pretty good fit at sub linebacker. Pairing him up to Isaiah Simmons, both of whom are built pretty similarly physically, especially both of them being really tall, I think that would be a lot of fun. But if you want someone who's even taller than Fred Blunt, what about 6'7" Roderick Anderson, who was Fred Blunt's backup this year at Westlake? I think Roderick Anderson should have stayed in school. I think he had a real shot of being a first or second round pick next year, but he decided to declare early, which was a major surprise. But I'd be very surprised if he didn't get drafted just based on his physical upside. He didn't get a whole lot of opportunities to play, but again, 6'7", the athleticism is certainly there. He's a lot more raw than Fred Blunt, but again, we could draft him and play him in sub packages. And as I said, a majority of our snaps are in sub packages, so he could be a fun pick. Along with him, guys like Trey Hughes and Jacarl Henderson lead a very deep group at safety. So there's your draft class. We went over all those guys throughout the prospect profiles this season, and I was enjoying letting you guys in on them once again, see whose stocks have gone up and down. So now let's talk mock draft. You guys know I'm a big mock draft nerd, so we've got 2 from the game, and then I ended up making 1 as well. So this is the first one for Madden. A lot of chalk early. They have Bryson Barraclough at number 1. Drake Nelson at number 2 is interesting. The Raiders used their second first-round pick last year on Callum Jupiter. I'd be very surprised if they went quarterback, but I could see it happening. Orlando Higgins and Zahir Yaha at 3 and 4. Those picks both make sense. Crawford Shawcross at 5 to the New Orleans Saints, giving up on Braylon DeBose-Dur. I'd be a little bit surprised by that, but again, I could see it. And then outside of that, Norman Collier, the other quarterback, not in the first round. Wilton Edmonton at 18, that's really good value. Again, if he falls that far, maybe we move up for him. Josh Demerit at 23 is very interesting. As I said, he's been a huge draft riser as of recent. And they just going with Abraham Belkett Jr., the left tackle out of NC State. I could see that happening because Tyler Palumbo's on the last year of his contract. The other mock draft is really similar. There are a few small changes. Blake Wilson moving up to 8, leading to a domino effect of changes. The biggest one here is Norman Collier to the Colts at 17. We talked about the possibility of Indianapolis moving on from quarterback Malachi Madison. I don't think they accepted his fifth-year option, so maybe they're going to give up on Madison entirely and go the route of picking a quarterback, which means Malachi Madison would be on the trade block, which would be really interesting. They had us going with Abraham Belkett Jr. again there at 30. So I made 2 separate mock drafts. I made a first-round edition, and I also made a 7-round mock draft just for the Eagles. So we're going to go over both of those, starting with my first-round mock draft. At 1, Bryson Barraclough. Pretty simple. He's going to be the number 1 pick. It's just a matter of which team. Will it be Atlanta or could we see a trade? At 2, I had the Raiders go Orlando Higgins Jr. They have floated the idea of picking a quarterback. Maybe they really like the upside of Drake Nelson, but they need wide receivers so badly. Callum Jupiter had nobody to throw it to last year, and his offensive line was dreadful as well. So although maybe they don't really see the upside in Callum Jupiter, he also never really had a fair shot last year. So I think they would be wise to not go the QB route and pick Higgins. I had Seattle picking Drake Nelson at 3, which probably would be a big surprise, but with a new head coach in Brian Daboll, maybe they just want to reset at the quarterback position. Capricus Falconbridge is on the final year of his contract, and they have no reasons to pay him at this point. Zahir Yahad to the Jets at 4. That pick seems pretty easy. I had the Saints going with Crawford Shawcross, the quarterback out of Wisconsin. I don't think they should make that pick, but I think there's a good shot they will because they've really tried to address the quarterback position throughout this series and haven't really figured it out. Kamari Hunter, the pass rusher out of Oklahoma State to Miami Dolphins. They drafted their franchise quarterback last year with Greg Waters-Key. So they're really hoping that both of these quarterbacks go in the top 5 so they have a more wide range of players to pick from. We haven't really talked about Kamari Hunter in depth a lot, but he is a really talented pass rusher, probably the second best one in this draft class behind Zahir Yahya, and will definitely be a top 10 pick. After him, we've got the first 2 Westlake players off the board with Darsheen Brooks Jr. going to the Bills, giving Tre'Davious White a running mate at corner, and Blake Wilson, the tackle out of Westlake, going to the Rams. He's been a major draft riser since the Combine. I have Wilton Edmonton going to the Giants at 9. Please, Lord, no, I do not want Joey Bosa on one side and Wilton Edmonton on the other. Ladarian Mobley from Oklahoma going at 10 to Carolina. So 4 pass rushers in the top 10. The pass rushers flying off the board. And we have another one at 11 with Adafa Klafawar going to Detroit. So that's 5 pass rushers in the top 11 picks. After that, I've got Knox Hodgson to the Washington football team. That'd be a fun pick for them. I would enjoy playing against him twice a year because he's a fun player. Malik Arnold to the Cardinals. They lost out on Rondale Moore. He signed with the Denver Broncos in free agency, so they need a new receiver. Lewis Palmer, the guard out of Westlake, to the Titans. Ray Marcoli Jr. to the Broncos. Give Patrick Surtain a buddy at corner. Nehemiah Surwick, wide receiver, Texas Tech, to the Browns, giving themselves another target for Russell Wilson. The Cleveland Browns have not had a great receiving core throughout this series, so I could see them investing a pretty high draft pick into that position. I thought about the idea of giving the Colts quarterback Norman Collier, but I just can't see it. So instead, I gave them the tackle Zachariah Westerschlott out of Stanford. I could still see them trading Malachi Madison. I think there's a world where that happens, but I think that'd be a bad move for them. Malachi Madison's significantly more talented than Norman Collier, even if Madison hasn't lived up to the hype of being a number 1 overall draft pick. So I think the Colts should avoid quarterback, and I'm really excited to see what they end up doing. And if they do pick Norman Collier, where the hell does Malachi Madison end up? That'll be a fun storyline. Hedigan Patrice, the tackle from Nebraska, to the Bengals. Fred Blunt to the Rams. So the Rams add 2 Westlake players. Deshaun McKinley to the Chargers, add another lineman. Frank Washington, the other Westlake safety, goes to Green Bay. Abraham Belkett Jr., the tackle from NC State, to Atlanta. Chauncey Burks, linebacker out of Baylor, to the Niners. And Seattle gives themselves a receiver for quarterback Drake Nelson as they get Joe D. Gentry from UNC. To round out the first round, I have Norman Collier going to the Vikings at 25. Derek Carr had a really good season for Minnesota, leading them to a playoff win. but Derek Carr is getting older. He's one of the oldest starting quarterbacks in the entire league right now. So maybe they look to replace him because obviously he's not the long-term answer. And with Norman Collier on the board, that could make sense. And Norman Collier actually really reminds me a whole lot of Derek Carr. Kenneth Barker to the Bengals. They could look to add another linebacker. I think that's fair value for him. The New England Patriots, they need another receiver pretty badly, so they add the second Kentucky player off the board in Shiloh Seekers II. He'll join forces with Odell Beckham and Josiah Mendez. Iame Duyo, the tackle out of Alabama, to the Cowboys. Really fun pick for Baltimore, adding another explosive piece to the offense with Westlake receiver Theodore Williamson. And then us at 30. But this board plays out really well for us. We could go with the guard Thread Campbell. We could go with one of the defensive tackles like Zaire Savage. In this scenario, I have us getting cornerback Josh Demerit. This doesn't necessarily mean that I would pick Demerit in this situation, but he's definitely an option. Corner Marion Smith-Gardner, also another option. So this board really plays out well for us. So hopefully this draft ends up looking like this because this would be an ideal sample of players to pick from. With the last two picks, I had Julito Atkins, wide receiver, going to the Chiefs. They lost Jalen Waddle in the offseason. He signed big money with Atlanta. So they need a running mate with Terry McLaurin at wide receiver, and then Marion Smith-Gardner to the Bucs at 32. That'd be really, really good value. As for the 7th-round mock draft for the Eagles, I always like to do 2 different first-round picks just to change it up. So in this scenario, I had us getting Zaire Savage, the defensive tackle out of Cincinnati, who would, in my opinion, really make a big impact day one, even with the additions of Aaron Donald and J.J. Watt. In the 2nd round, I knew I wanted to address tight end. I think there's a good shot Tryman Bird is off the board, but if he's not, I find it very unlikely that we would pass him up. Machado Yamaguchi from USC would also really fit this range, so I could see him being the pick as well. At 94, it was a little bit harder to figure out where I thought we would go with, so I went with Jalen Kozak out of UCLA. He's a 6'4" corner who could be a good developmental option. Got to keep in mind, Nehemiah Richardson and C.J. Thomas both don't have that much longer left on their contracts. Thomas only has 1 year. Richardson has 2, including the 5th-year team option. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to pay both of those guys because we've got a lot of money that we're going to have to pay around soon. So if we were to hypothetically let C.J. Thomas go, if he wants too much money, we could replace him with another former UCLA corner with Kozak. I then focused on depth in the trenches with Deion McCoy, the center out of Westlake. I figured there was a good shot I'd pick at least one Westlake player, so there you go. And then I went with Texas A&M pass rusher Neoze Booker. Then I rounded out the draft with 6'4" safety Ryan Jovanovich. Again, I figured I'd pick a Metropolis player, so I ended up going with Jovanovich in that scenario. So there is my 7th-round mock draft for the Philadelphia Eagles. Let me know what you thought of the draft preview down below in the comments. It was certainly fun, but time-consuming to create. So next episode will be the NFL Draft. That'll be premiering within the next couple of days. I'll let you guys know a little bit closer on the YouTube community tab when that ends up being. So make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know which players you think we should look to draft down below in the comment section. I want to hear what you guys have to say with that. Peace out. Go Birds.